Kiddushin Daf Yud Gimel Amud Bet, until death do us part, mitat bal manalan. I'm talking particularly from the man's perspective, from the male perspective. One of the difficult adjustments for a man to make after his wedding, and he has to make it immediately. Right after the chuppah, he's got to make this adjustment, is that the woman he's with now, after chuppah and kiddushin, is not the same girl he was dating. There's a change in being, there's a change in essence of the woman. This is not the same person. And we'll learn in the sugya some of what that means. And a man sometimes continues along the trajectory that he was dating, particularly in those relationships where there's a long dating period, and then they get married and they kind of carry on living as if nothing's changed. But everything changes at the time of chuppah and kiddushin. And a lot of the marital difficulties during the first couple of years are the man's difficulty in recalibrating and adjusting to the fact that he has a wife at the moment. I was going to say, and not a girlfriend, but we said the other day there's no such thing as a girlfriend, but not a fiance. He doesn't have a color anymore. He doesn't have a fiance anymore. He has a wife, and a wife is a completely different bria. She's a completely different being. So much so that in the Gemara, what we're going to be looking at is how enduring is this husband-wife connection. So on the one level, there's a legal agreement between the two of them. There's a marriage, there's a marital agreement. Clearly, that marital agreement is made for the lifetime of the marriage. Should the marriage be terminated by a get or by the death of either party, the agreement is over. That's clear. But there's a whole lot more happening other than the legal arrangement between the two. As we know, firstly, there's an emotional connection. There's a physical connection we've been learning about. V'hayu lebasar echad. Okay, so maybe the emotional connection at the end of the marriage, whether by get or by death, the emotional connection falls apart. Maybe the physical connection falls apart. They're no longer living together. But we know there's more than that. There's a cosmic connection, there's a metaphysical connection, there's an ashomadika connection. Something changes. As we've said, the woman's not the same woman. The girl you take home after the chuppah kiddushin is not the girl you were dating. This is a different bria, she's a different being. Does that just change? What, does she become back to who she used to be? With a get or with the termination of life or the end of life, if a man dies? We'll see from the Gemara, it's not such a simple assumption for the Gemara that if a man dies, the marriage is over. We kind of take that for granted. In the non-Jewish tradition, say for example the Catholic tradition, it's clear that if a man dies, the marriage is over. It's not clear that if there's a divorce, the marriage is over. The Catholic tradition doesn't recognize divorce. We recognize divorce, but we have to see where from. From the pasuk, the Torah tells us, Ki isha, and then if it doesn't work out, v'katav la sefer kritut, as we've been learning in the whole of Masechta Gittin. But in the case of death, there, in every tradition, it's obvious that death, the marriage is over. Maybe not in some of the Hindu traditions where the woman commits suicide after the death of the husband. But what is the Torah's view? So the Gemara asks, on our Mishnah it says, V'kona et atzma beget u'v'mitat habal. We've learned how a man acquires a woman, how a man invests in a woman. But how can a woman recover her independence after that investment has taken place? Two ways, says the Mishnah. Either using a get, which is the whole of Masechta Gittin that we learned, and we discussed in our first shiur on Kiddushin, why Gittin comes before Kiddushin, why you've actually got to understand how complex the separation is in order to understand how deep the connection is. And if the connection is so deep, how can she extricate herself from that deep connection? One way is through a get, and the other way is if the husband dies. Ask the Gemara, Bishlam, I get, I understand a get. Why does a get work? You would think, well, logically, if you got into an agreement to get married, you can get into agreement to terminate the marriage like any other agreement. Well, that would be true if a kiddushin was nothing but an agreement. But we've just said kiddushin's a whole lot more than that. So how do we know a get worked? Zichtiv v'chatav la sefer kritut. If it weren't for the pasuk in the Torah, if Hashem didn't tell us specifically there is a mechanism by which to divorce a wife, we would not assume that is a possibility. The reason we know that get works, says our Gemara, is because katav la sefer kritut ela mitat habal manalan. But how do we know that death works? There seems to be an assumption in the Gemara that if we don't have a pasuk, if we don't have a clear injunction in the Torah that says that death terminates a marriage, we wouldn't know that death terminates a marriage. How can that be? Would we really not have thought yes? Because we're saying legally, death terminates a marriage. Emotionally, maybe death terminates a marriage. Physically, for sure, death terminates a marriage. But metaphysically, in terms of the spiritual meaning of a marriage, maybe death doesn't terminate. Maybe the soul, we talk about soulmates. If they're soulmates, then only the body of the man died. I suppose one has to be a little careful using that term soulmate. If you say, my darling, you are my soulmate, maybe that means, and after 120 years when I die, we're still soulmates. You can't marry anybody else. Or do we say, no, this is not soulmates, but whatever mates you are, that kind of ends with death. Where do we know it from? Mitzat where do we know from that even the death of the husband can terminate a marriage? So the Gemara attempts to answer, and Svara hu asra hu sharta, it's logical. He created the connection, so by dying, he terminates the connection, which is an interesting idea, as we're going to see in Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, an idea that Reb Shimon Shkop develops, which is that it's an ongoing investment. It's not that you give a woman a ring under the chuppah and now you're done. It's an ongoing investment, a daily investment. Hu asra, and by investing in his wife daily, he makes her forbidden to anybody else, and then he stops investing, he dies. So at that point, at that point, she becomes muteret. So it's logic. Says the Gemara, no, you can't use that logic. So I thought of that, but you can't use that logic. Ha-arayot asala velo shariluhu. Who creates the forbidden arayot? For example, a man marries a woman. From that moment, she's forbidden to the man's brothers, other than the case of Yibum. And if he dies and he has children, she's still forbidden to the brothers. That doesn't go away. So you see that death doesn't fully terminate the change in status that came over the woman under the chuppah, that even after death something continues. So you can't just say, well, he created it, so when he dies it's gone. Something remains. We know that something remains. How much remains is what we're looking at. Does the Isur Eshet Ish still remain? Is she still forbidden to anybody? Is she allowed to remarry? Really important question. The Gemara goes backwards and forwards trying to prove it. Eventually the Pasuk says, we learn it from an obscure place. Pen yamut b'milchama v'ish acher yikachena. If a man is married, is become betrothed to a woman and he has not yet married her, and there's a war and he's called up to the army, he gets a ptur from the army in case he'll die in the war, and then somebody else will marry his wife, and that's a terrible thought for him to get going into war with. So you see, ish acher yikachena, another man is allowed to marry his widow. Otherwise there wouldn't be a problem with fear. That's where we know from that an Eshet Ish is muteret achar mitat habal, that a woman may remarry after the death of the husband. So something terminates with the death. The Tosfos Reed says, we've discussed that there are many different Tosfos. We've got the Tosfos on our page, and then there were lots of Rishonim. We have the Tosfos that various different Rishonim wrote, which are the notes of the shiurim when they taught the Gemara. And we said Tosfos is about zooming out, looking at it from a broader perspective, and we have their notes. The Tosfos Reed, Rabbi Yeshaya Detrani, is one of those important Baalei Tosfos that we have. He's of the Italian school that we discussed the other day, but he learnt in the German school. And he says, no, of course we know that a woman's allowed to remarry after her husband's death. That's not what the Gemara is talking about. We know that from Tanakh. There were lots of cases. David HaMelech married the wife of Naval, the widow of Naval. We've got lots of cases of men marrying widows. That's not the issue. The issue is that wouldn't be allowed if there weren't a posuk in the Torah. So there must be a posuk in the Torah. We're searching for a posuk. It's not that we're trying to re-establish the law. The law is clearly after the husband dies, she can remarry. Question is, where does it say so in the Torah? That's what the Tosfos Reed says. But from Tosfos, it's clear that that's not the case. Our Tosfos holds, that if we didn't have this posuk, that pen yamut b'milchama v'ish acher yikachena, if we didn't have this posuk specifically allowing a woman to remarry after the death of the husband, the assumption would be she's not allowed to remarry. And Tosfos says the only reason we've got specific Isurim in the cases of Arayot, all the other forbidden relationships are specifically forbidden after the death of the husband as well. Why does the Torah have to tell us that? Because, says Tosfos, if nothing would have been said anywhere, we wouldn't need the Torah to tell us that. We would know that death does not terminate the relationship between a man and his wife, and all the Isurim still apply. Once we have a posuk that says she's allowed to remarry, now the question is, what about the husband's brothers, and all the other arayot, all the other forbidden relationships during the life of the marriage, do they perpetuate or do they terminate? After a wife dies, a man could marry, midorais, a man could marry the wife's sister, although during a lifetime he can't. But the other way around, a woman can't marry her late husband's brother, even after the death. So Tosfos says, if it weren't that we were told specifically that a woman may remarry a stranger, another person, if we didn't know that, then we wouldn't need specific isurim for arayot, la'achar mita, for after death. We would know that they all perpetuate forever. So you see that according to Tosfos, the assumption is that marriage is for life. Not just for life, that marriage is for the life of the woman. That even if the man dies, the connection continues. That's how deep that connection is, that death doesn't end it, other than because we have the posuk of pen yamut b'milchama v'ish acher yikachena. Why does that work, and how does that work? So there's a very classical Rabbi Chonon, and in the source sheets I've brought you the entire piece of Rabbi Chonon Wasserman. Rabbi Chonon Wasserman died in 1941 during the Holocaust. He was murdered brutally by the Nazis together with his community, his Talmudim. They were hiding in Kovna at the time. We've spoken about it before. Rabbi Chonon gave a major shiur at the fort in Kovna where they were about to be shot. He held up the shooting while he talked to his community about how to die al Kiddush Hashem. And he said, we are the korbanot, we are sacrifices. And through the korban that Am Yisrael is bringing in us, there will be a major change in the well-being of Am Yisrael after this is all over. We are the korban. To facilitate that change, we have to be the korban. If we're the korban, we've got to be careful that there's no pigul. And pigul means that a bad thought in the mind of the person doing the korban, of the kohen, the shechting the korban, or sometimes the owner, can destroy the validity of the korban. If we're all korbanot, let's be careful that there's nothing in our mind that could make the korban invalid, because that would be a terrible waste of life. We would be giving our lives and we wouldn't be the korban tahor that we need to be. And he taught them what they need to have in their mind, the purity of mind that they needed before they went to their death. Just imagine what a human being can be, who a human being can be, a malach Hashem tzvakos, an angel of Hashem, Rabbi Chonon Wasserman. And he learned from Reb Shimon Shkop, he learned from Reb Chaim Brisker, he was a Talmud of the Chofetz Chaim, he was a Chavrusa of the Ponevezher for a short period of time in Radin, in the yeshiva of the Chofetz Chaim. But he learned the principle from his Rebbe, from Reb Shimon Shkop, and he explains that there are two things that take place at the wedding. There is a kinyan, there is an investment that takes place that creates this relationship between man and wife. And that investment has certain implications. But there's also an issur that is created. She becomes an eshet ish. And the question is, the kinyan is an ongoing flow of energy from husband to wife throughout the lifetime of the marriage. He's investing in her every day. And that daily investment in his wife is what keeps that connection flourishing, what keeps that connection healthy. When he dies, that connection stops. So the kinyan aspect of the marriage clearly ends when he dies. That's not what the Gemara is talking about. The question is the Isur piece, this that she's forbidden to anybody else, that she changes her halachic status from being a pnuya, a woman who's available, to being a woman who is an eshet ish, a different being, as we said after the chuppah. An eshet ish is a different being. She's now an isha, she's a wife. She's no longer a girl or a woman. She's an eshet ish, she's his wife. Is that an outcome of the kinyan, of this investment? In which case, when the investment stops, the Isser also stops. Is the reason that she's forbidden to everybody else is because he's investing in her? Is it an ownership thing? Or do we say, no, they're two separate things, as we've discussed before. Harayat mekudesh li, Tosfos on Daf Beis, means it's as if I'm being makdish you. It's as if I'm dedicating you to me. And in that dedication, there's exclusivity and there's isur. It's like making hektish. It's like saying this object will belong to the Beit HaMikdash. Now, if you do that, if you were to say this object will belong to the Beit HaMikdash, you can't undo that with a get. You can't change your mind the next week and undo it and say, okay, I'm taking it back. And even death doesn't undo it. Once you've made it hektish, that's it. You've created an isur. The isur is an isur olami, as Rabbi Chonon says. So that's the question here. The kinyan, I understand, stops after death. But where does the isur come from? Does the isur come from the kinyan, in which case it also stops after death? Or is this a separate thing? That he initiates a change of status in the woman that can't be undone, even by the death of the man. The Gemara comes to the conclusion, death, normally it wouldn't be. We wouldn't just assume that the death undoes that piece. I understand that death understands that investment relationship. She's no longer my wife. But is she still an Eshet Ish? Does she still have the din of an Eshet Ish? And the Gemara comes to the conclusion that death is like a get. Isha kona et atzma. It's an action. It's not just something passive that he stops investing in her. All of a sudden, the tap gets turned off and the investment stops. Yes, there is that happening, but that doesn't affect the halachic status, the Isur status. What death is in addition to that, death is like a get. It's a termination. It's an active termination of that whole package which created the Eshet Ish. And that then ends it. And so it's important for us to understand in our relationship with our wives, for us to educate our children in their relationship with their wives, and for us to be aware of what this really means, that there are two elements of that relationship. The first thing is to be aware that the woman we are married to is not the woman we dated. We dated a girl or a young woman, and we married to a wife. And a wife and a girl or a young woman or a friend or a fiance, not the same being. There's a change, there's an emotional change, there's a spiritual change, there's a legal change, there's a physical change. Not the same being. And that's part of the dinim of tzniut that govern a married woman. The idea of covering hair. Part of that is she's not the same person, so she presents herself in a different way. The world needs to see that she's not the same person. She needs to make a statement, and even though not all traditions have the hair covering, although many do, many of the ancient traditions, it's fairly modern that married women don't cover their hair in the non-Jewish world, never mind in the Jewish world. But always there's a ring, there's something that a married woman has to tell the world, I'm not that same person anymore. I'm a married woman, it's different. So the one thing is for us to understand that there is a change in status, there's an elevation of status. There are a whole lot of new sets of halachot that belong to a married woman. And we've often said the number of halachot that govern an object or a person or time or a place determine the level of kedusha of that. So as a woman becomes married, a whole new set of halachot are applied to her. That means a whole new set of kedusha. Her sanctity is elevated. There's a whole lot of sanctity there that applies more so to her than to him, because there are more new halachot that apply to her than apply to him. And he needs to know that the woman he's now married to is a woman who's on a much higher level, on a much higher status than the woman he was dating. Traditionally, and ordinarily, the opposite takes the place. The man treats the girl very well when he still has to try and persuade her to marry him. Once they're married, his attentiveness starts deteriorating. So to be the opposite, your honor, the way you honor a wife has to be 1,000,000 times more than the way you treated your girlfriend or your fiance. This is an Eshet Ish, this is your wife, this is a completely different being. That's the first thing we need to understand. And the second thing we need to understand is that, as Reb Shimon and Reb Chanan Wasserman explain, that relationship of Hareyat B'Kudeshet Li, I'm investing in you and thereby dedicating you to me, that's not a once-off statement under the chuppah, that's a daily recommitment. And we discussed in Gittin that part of the gift of Gittin, the fact that a man can divorce a woman unilaterally, gives the woman the security that the man in the marriage is there by choice. He could walk out, he could divorce her. If he's there by choice, but with that choice needs to come a daily recommitment. I'm invested in you. You are my wife. You are my wife again today. You were my wife yesterday, and you are my wife again today. And you will be my wife again tomorrow. And I will invest in you each day in the same way, and I will honor you and treat you with the dignity and the honor that you deserve each day that we are together, not only until death, but in a sense even after that. If it were not for the posuk, Ve'ish acher yikachena, our relationship would continue. But as it happens, death allows you to remarry, but until that time, you are mine, and I am totally committed to honoring you and to investing in you.